Welcome to Iceland. My name is Mary Frances Davidson.
And my name is Julie Ingham, and we work for the UNESCO Grow Fisheries Training Programme. In this video series, we will be exploring Sustainable Development Goal 14.
Sustainable Development Goal 14 relates to life in water and how we can build a path toward conserving living aquatic resources in our oceans and seas.
There are 10 targets within SDG 14, and 5 of them deal with fisheries and how humans can use the living aquatic resources to build the future we want.
SDG 14 deals with interactions between humans and aquatic ecosystems. All over the world, people rely on these systems to provide them with food, income, livelihoods, and not to mention ecosystem services like regulation of the global climate.
In this way, as we work together towards achieving the targets of SDG 14, we are also considering the other Sustainable Development Goals, including ending poverty, ending hunger, good health, quality education, and of course, climate change.
For over 20 years, the Fisheries Training Program in Iceland has been working toward building capacity in developing countries to sustainably manage living aquatic resources.
Through training and research, we've worked all over the world. We've trained over 400 fisheries professionals, working with research institutions, universities, and government agencies in developing countries.
In this SDG 14 video series, we explore some of the major issues facing the development of fisheries across the world today.
At the end of this video, we post some questions, which we hope will help you reflect on the fisheries where you live and what might be needed to address the targets of Sustainable Development Goal 14.
Sustainable Development Goal Target 14b aims to provide access for small-scale artisanal fishers to marine resources and markets. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that about 2/3 of all fish caught for direct human consumption comes from small-scale fisheries. Moreover, 90% of the people directly employed and dependent on capture fisheries are in the small-scale fisheries sector. But what do we actually mean when we use the term small-scale fisheries? The definition has changed over time and may be different depending on where you live. We tend to think of small-scale fisheries as being rooted in local communities, traditions, and values. We imagine that small-scale fishers are self-employed and usually provide food for their communities and households. Tumi Tómasson is a fisheries biologist who has worked all over the world in fisheries development, and he's going to take us through the concept of small-scale fisheries, how it's changed over time, and how we can apply it today. Tumi, you have been working as a fisheries scientist for the past 30 years. You've lived all over the world, spent time living in South Africa, in Malawi, in Sri Lanka, and Iceland, of course. And I'm curious to start by asking, how has global fisheries changed from the time that you started working until now?
Well, it varies, you know. If you look at Iceland, things have really revolutionized in the last 20, 30 years. It has gone from an industry that emphasis was mainly on volume, not value. People or captains were rewarded for the biggest catch. But all of that changed in 1984. There was no more the king of the fishing, and the power went to the processing plants, and people became more conscious of value. And the industry changed from a fairly basic raw material provider to a knowledge-based industry with more than trebling of the value of the catch in relation to the volume. So you also see changes in developing countries. You see increased mechanization. You see you see, of course, a huge increase in fishing effort, more people entering the business. In some places, this is maybe not quite as evident, but almost wherever you go, people talk about that the resources closest to shore are at risk. There's a common argument that you should try to get more effort, relocate the effort to further offshore, but usually that comes as an addition to what is there before, not a change in the group that you have.
And what about trends just in fisheries production over the past, say, 30 to 50 years?
Yeah, it's very interesting to look at. You know, FAO was established in 1945 after the war, like other UN organizations and the UN itself. They have been collecting global statistics and publish every 2 years the SOFIA report, State of Fisheries and Aquaculture in the world. And their most recent report came out in 2020, this year. And there they have statistics since 1950. And after the war, there was a big increase in catch. You know, fish stocks have been basically protected because of the war on the seas to some extent. And so it was a lot of fish around, and there was a very rapid growth, like 7% year on year, all the way into the 1970s. And we thought that we could fish endlessly. The resources were infinite. And that all changed in the 70s when the consequences of this unlimited growth started to happen. And then there was quite a reduction in the growth, but there was still growth in the fisheries until the mid-1980s. At that time, the total global catch stood at about 90 million tons, 6 million from inland fisheries and the rest from marine fisheries. And since then, it has just fluctuated around 90 million tons. What has happened during this time is that in the mid-1980s, about 50% of the global catch came from developing countries. But today, and for the past decade or two, the contribution from developing countries is about 70%. So the fishing has shifted with the resultant increased import of fish into the European Union and Japan and North America.
If you reflect on when small-scale fisheries was first studied or classified, how did that come about, and has it changed at all since it was first described?
Well, yeah, you know, fisheries, when we talk about fisheries, you can characterize them by what is caught, like a cod fishery, where it is caught, like the Icelandic fishery, or where in the water it is caught, like a pelagic fishery. So I think small-scale fishery we started to use as a common term for this low investment type fisheries, mainly in developing countries. We also have them in Iceland and all over the world, but here they mean a totally different thing. I sometimes say, you know, a 12-meter long vessel in Iceland will catch maybe 1,000 tons a year, which is more than 300 small-scale fishermen or vessels in Granada, for instance, will catch in a year. But it was in 1980 that David Thompson, he tried to classify global fisheries into small-scale and large-scale, mainly to highlight the importance of the small-scale artisanal type fisheries of the time, which hadn't really received that much attention, not least in like development cooperation. emphasis was much more on large-scale industrial type fisheries. He looked at the number of, he divided the fisheries into small and large scale, but he also looked at how many people were involved in fisheries, and what happened to the catch, and how much fuel was used, etc. And who consumed it. It was mainly for local consumption, like you mentioned earlier. And this table then, this Tómasson table, as it has been known since then, has been updated several times. And the last update that I know of was in 2014 by Jeppe Kolding and his co-workers at the University of Bergen. And if we look at the first table in 1980, it was estimated that we had about 8 million small-scale fishermen. In 2012, they were up to 35 million. So there was like a fourfold increase in number of fishers during this time, but the catch maybe doubled. So the catch per fisherman then halved.
So, Tumi, you were just describing that the number of fishers engaged in the small-scale sector has increased a lot, while the amount that each fisher is actually catching hasn't increased nearly so much. Do you have any examples that you've seen of this?
Yes, we have a very good example from Tanzania, from the coastal fisheries in Tanzania. Upendo, a former fellow, did here in our program. In the mid-90s, the total catch was about 40,000 tons, and for 2012, it had grown to about 50,000 tons. So a slight increase, well, 25% increase over this period. But at the same time, there was a huge increase in fishermen and vessels. And if you look at them as a measure of fishing effort, in 1995, each fisherman brought about 3.5 tons per year. But at the end of the period, they were bringing like 1.2 tons. So like a third of what they had. Even if the total increased, because of the rapid increase of number of fishermen and vessels, there was quite a significant decrease in the catch per fisherman. So even if you see that some people invest in the fisheries and enter it, that also affects those that are there already.
Yeah. I'd like to take us back a little bit to how we classify small-scale fisheries and this question of what makes a fishery small-scale or artisanal. From your experience, do you have any examples of watching this definition shift in real time or change?
Well, it depends, always on the context. In some cases, you can say that this is sort of poverty-driven, and the vessels are, especially when people are using dugout canoes, they're getting smaller and smaller as the trees that they use get smaller and less accessible. But mainly what you see is that they are getting larger and they're getting more mechanized, and they're being powered by engines. In 1980, when Tómasson did this table, he estimated that for every ton of fuel that you spent in small-scale fisheries, they maybe caught 20 tons of fish. But in 2010, they caught maybe a third of that per ton of fuel. So that's an indication of how things have changed. We can also look at a more concrete example from this time from Uganda. There we had a fellow, Veronica. She was looking at the fishery on Lake Victoria, and the number of vessels over time. In 2006, there were about 5,000 motorized vessels and about 16,000 paddled vessels in the fishery. But in 2014, the number of motorized vessels have gone up to about 10,000, roughly doubled. But there were no increase in the paddled vessels. So the larger and the better vessels, they can go further out. They can start fishing on new fishing grounds. And that is also what is confusing when you talk about overfishing, is that the catch per unit effort is not limited to the same area or part of the stock as before. So it masks the real decline. It's much bigger than what we see because you are accessing fresh resources, natural resources.
So taking these two concrete examples together, the decrease in catch per unit effort, but also the increase in modernization and motorization of boats, which leads to new fishing ground. Both of these taken together shows what? That the small-scale fisheries are being overfished? Or is this an indication of overfishing?
Yes, I would say this is a very strong indication of overfishing. But what is also more concerning is that what is happening then within the societies, you know. There are winners and there are losers. So maybe we should study that and see how well it agrees with our idea of reducing poverty. We may be putting some people into poverty by increasing the fisheries.
I want to take us back to SDG 14B and the target that aims to provide access for small-scale artisanal fishers to marine resources, because it seems like there might be a trade-off to be had here, or at least if we're going to try and meet the target to manage fisheries for MSY and also provide access, what do you see as the path for making both of those come true, or what are the roadblocks maybe to doing that?
Well, I don't think there's a simple answer to this. But in 2008, you know, the FAO convened a global conference on small-scale fisheries in Thailand, and they've had a few of them since then. They've worked very hard at providing guidelines, voluntary guidelines to securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. And they have identified a lot of threats in their document: tourism, you know, mining, energy generation, and other anthropogenic changes. But they don't mention the increased number of fishermen. And this uncontrolled growth, it is, in my view, it's a threat to biodiversity, it's a threat to the productive capacity of the resource, and it's a threat to the profitability of small-scale fisheries and to the people whose livelihoods are at stake.
So what would you recommend to make sure that we're providing access for these small-scale artisanal fishers while preserving the biodiversity and the resource itself?
Well, I think you need to maybe stop talking about small-scale fisheries as they were, you know, a homogeneous group of fishers with the same interests and and views. You know, you should maybe think of those that do this for subsistence and the artisanal component, and then you need to institute some serious management for the commercial part. This idea of providing access to small-scale fishers, to markets and to the resource, sure, they should, fishing communities that exist, they should have some sort of tenure to the resources. But what good does it do them if the growth or if the fishing effort is uncontrolled? So the people investing in new fisheries, if I look at Uganda again, this is not necessarily the people in the communities investing. There are people there that own 25 vessels that they operate. That's a bit of a far cry from the small-scale fishermen that you described here in the introduction. It is highly commercial. And this is also the problem that we have, is that the idea of what is small scale is shifting the whole time. And so the division between what is small scale and large scale, they become blurred. And whatever system we need that we devise to talk about this has got the same problem. So I think we need to look at the situation in each country. We need to collect more evidence, more information, more data, and I think we are at a time in our history where it's the most important of all is capacity building, like we do in our program. And research and capacity building is at the heart of the small-scale voluntary guidelines for FAO. And we are, in our program, we are actually just implementing it through fellows that are taking part in the GROW Fisheries training program, a very important step where we assist then fellows from developing countries, from poorer countries, to collect and analyze and interpret fisheries data and evaluate the results and try to find sustainable solutions.
Dr. Tumi Tómasson explained some of the challenges associated with providing access to small-scale fisheries in line with SDG 14B. Reflecting on your own fisheries, how do you see this work in practice? What kind of information do you have in your country about small-scale artisanal fisheries? Are the boats registered? Do you know their catch? Have the non-motorised boats been motorised, or are the new boats motorised? What kind of regulations, if any, are being applied in small-scale fisheries where you live? What are the priorities for fisheries management in your country, and how do those relate to SDG 14B?